Okay.
You're all set to go.
I do.
Okay.
I do it.
Is it
I do
a
it.
little bit more sweet on it? Or maybe, is this my coffee or is this?
This is not.
Nu?
We gotta start because we have to break at 3.
That's good.
Today is Wednesday, right?
Yes.
Wednesday.
Yeah. So tomorrow is our final day.
Great. Yeah, the exam is tomorrow.
Are you start taking? You can go ahead and start. Okay.
Well, the crescendo tomorrow I want to dedicate it to the type of debates raised by the book The Place of Tolerance in Islam. And so I not only want to talk about my essay, but I want to talk about the responses. So, do make an effort to, if you haven't read the book already, to go through it and to just be prepared to discuss the various responses. Now, of course, part of the challenge in a text like this is that when you get so many responses, on the one hand, it's good because you're showing the variety of ways that people react to your discourse, but on the other hand, an effective response to the responses is not very effective. You try to be polite by saying something about each response, but it's not possible to really but anyway, do make an effort to because I think ultimately this is what is a good or an important point to close on. The article. Can you see if Grace is still outside? Because I need Wilder's speech, which is supposed to be a copy.
Yeah, I also read the Abdullah Jan. It's a different point. Not in a religious point of view, but more political point of view.
Yes, and it's very interesting what. Something that I'll tell you what even becomes of him, and because remember this book was published, 2003, something like that.
It was before the Iraq War. I saw that.
Yeah.
Because they were talking about the Ba'ath Party still being in power.
2001, 82, the date.
Yeah.
2002 is the copyright.
Yeah.
So maybe published 2003.
No, it 2000. So it did come out 2002. So it was before the invasion, after 9/11.
Okay, thank you.
And a lot of things happened with these different people that responded to my essay afterwards, including some people that were at the time not known at all became stars. Some people who were well known became nobodies. Some people had their life destroyed. Some people had their, it's very interesting. Part of the narrative is to, because the selecting who to respond to my essay was a process of back and forth with the editors. As to, some of the people I wanted to respond, they did not invite. Some of the people I didn't think were relevant, they insisted on inviting to respond. And it is material to the worldview right after the attack and before the invasion. And it's also very material to the substantive issue of, so here I was talking about tolerance in Islam, and I'll tell you, I'll focus on this tomorrow because I want to complete what we were talking about yesterday. But why did I write this essay, and why did I put this, or how did I come to write this essay, and since then, I've written on the topic, but I've written not about tolerance in Islam. I've written about tolerance in Europe. And I have to say that I am actually quite sad that I turned out to be correct about the history of there was a book published in England. I wrote the introduction to this book. It's a long. Does anyone have a copy of my resume? God, you never hear someone say it. Grace is not outside,
I
right?
think she's probably gone, but I'll check. Wait, you said you want a copy of your resume?
No, I want to ask her a question if she's still there. She's I have very, very selective memory. It's like I can remember when it comes to points on law or philosophy, I remember the page number, the line where something was said, but I could not, I'm not remember who published me a year ago or where I gave a lecture a year ago. I wrote, remember that book I wrote an introduction to, and it was,
Shattered Illusions, that one?
Shattered Illusions. Okay, what was the name of the editor of that book? Ahmed Malik or something like that. Yeah, something. Aftab Malik.
Aftab Malik.
Aftab Malik. Okay, so
Is that it?
yes, thank you. So there's a book that was published in England. It's still you can get it on Amazon. It's called Shattered Illusions, and it was edited by Aftab Malik. And I wrote the introduction to this book, and it was after I wrote The Place of Tolerance in Islam, and I reflected on the rise of the notion of tolerance in Europe, and what would become of the notion of tolerance in Europe. And what I thought was quite fascinating is that once attacked, either directly as attacked in people in the U.S. or in New York, or through proxy by people who, is Europe feeling part of the West and the U.S. as a part of the West, so they felt attacked by proxy. The question immediately became, what about tolerance in Islam? I'll tell you, and again, I've been in this whole seminar. I've been very interested in the issue of pedagogy, and pedagogically, that's what everyone was interested in debating at the time. What is the place of tolerance in Islam, and posing this question. And I was asked to address it. Now, I could have refused to address it, but I agreed to. And that raises a whole set of questions. And similarly, if you have, is there an extra copy of the thing I just distributed? Here, this is the speech by this guy geared to Wilders or Wilders, whatever. What is it? Wilders. And this is a guy that's been he's banned from entering England, but at the same time, in the United States, he recently received. There's something called the American Freedom Alliance. They gave him the Free Speech and Liberty Award. Of course, it's on his website. In England they've banned him coming in, and in the United States he got. It's called the Ronald Reagan Liberty Award, and his whole thing is hate Islam, ban the Quran, and the ban of the Quran is justified on freedom of speech grounds, which is quite interesting from a legal perspective, you know. He, of course, he sees the world in now, of course, it's in many, you could say, well, okay, they're religious bigots, and he's just another religious bigot. But at what point, which we've talked about this, you know, and this is the chair that I hold, Islam and Citizenship. At what point does a scholar engage a public issue? He celebrates that winning 4 seats in the European Parliament, and he says that his party came number 1 in Rotterdam, which is quite.
Muslims say probably.
Yeah, not only most Muslim city, but also, ironically, the city that is associated, its name associated with Erasmus, you know, one of the fathers of humanism. I mean, and while there's attachment to the humanist tradition is as tenuous as the attachment of Ferdinand and Isabella and the Inquisition to the Renaissance. You know, some in the delusional colonial minds of Winston Churchill, who he quotes quite repeatedly about Islam. The persecution of Muslims was a necessary step for the Renaissance, but this type of ahistorical historiography has thought to have been abandoned until, and interestingly, not until 9/11 and Bin Laden's attack, but until the rise of the conservative movement in the United States, known as the neocons. And it is really with the election of Reagan where it comes back, and it has such a presence that even Clinton, who doesn't belong to it, is unable to assert the classical sort of narrative of secular liberal humanism, and is forced into coexistence with the neoconservative movement, which ultimately he tolerates or cohabitates with, and ultimately it does a coup in the election of Bush and so on. And what is truly scary, actually, is not. It is what is truly scary. You know, I remember a lot of documentaries when Obama was running for elections, and you would go to the people who do these documentaries in the Midwest, right? And people would say things like, well, Obama, you know, his name sounds like Osama. And, you know, and this is on PBS documentaries. This is, you know, and they're going to vote against him because, how can we have a president who made the deciding factor for me is that he wants to use the name Hussein, and there was like a huge thing about. If he's elected, he's going to insist on swearing on the Quran instead of the Bible, and you know we can't have that happen. You know, some were saying, if Obama is elected, it will be the end of Israel, and you know this is the Antichrist. The theme of the Antichrist was quite, and it's remarkable how the what's his name, the guy who was running against Obama. McCain and this moron Sarah Palin, Sarah Palin. You know, if you remember earlier, there was a very similarly good-looking guy who ran for vice president, Quayle. You remember Dan Quayle?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I mean, an airhead, very much like Sarah Palin, but very bigoted, very fascist in spirit. if not ideology, right? And what's remarkable is how many votes they got. I mean, that is often overlooked by, and the extent to which Obama's administration, like Clinton's administration, finds itself with limited maneuvering space because of the continuing political clout of the neocons. And so, in many ways, the question of tolerance sums up, I mean, even this Wilder, I mean, his thing, Euronews, no tolerance for intolerance, no apology for being free. I mean, it's one of those, it's like the word Sharia for Puritans. You know, it's a symbol for all types of things. But it's also a symbol for things that are completely at odds with the spirit of Sharia or the morality of Sharia. But it is a powerful symbolic construct that now, I am now asked to respond to the speech. And it is like a moment, like the place of tolerance, and where you decide whether you're going to write on something or not write on something, right? And on the one hand, it's, if you've one of the things that I tend to read very widely, and so it reminds me of the material that I read about exorcisms. On the one hand, if you acknowledge evil in an exorcism, the priest is supposed to not engage in substantive debate with the possessed. And if that it's a fatal mistake, he does so because he's giving evil a moral foundation by doing so. And so the priest is supposed to always remember that this is not about an intellectual position being possessed, it's about a state of mind, and that is one of hate and anti-life, the satanic state. So here, an intellectual, I find myself in the same position. On the one hand, acknowledging it gives it a certain moral foundation. But at the other hand, not acknowledging it, not refuting it, or not saying something against it, it's as if you've possibly abandoned your duty to testify, shahada, to attest to truth and to justice, and so. Throughout your lives, you're going to confront the same question. You're going to confront it repeatedly, again and again. And I think, and ultimately, it's like some of the many Muslim philosophers, like Kindi, and also someone much more less surprising, like Ibn Aqil, who, of course, Ibn Arabi is a very obvious example, who said that, well, if you really analyze the nature of evil, it is simply the absence of good. It is like darkness is simply the absence of light. And I mean, it's a very fascinating discourse in itself. And so the evil of something like this is allowed to spread because what counterbalances it doesn't assert itself. It sits passively and allows the sun to be covered over, and then it finds itself engulfed by night. But yet, and it's very much like, it's like, how does a room become dirty? Well, you could affirmatively bring garbage into the room, or you could just stop cleaning, right? And now, of course, but every time there are in the same way that there are a lot of points to be made about why Khaled Abou El Fadl wrote The Place of Tolerance in Islam. A point, I don't remember now who well, actually, Jadullah makes it, it's like, oh, well, why do you even, you should not bother to say that there is, and there is a lot to say for that position, but at the same time there is a lot to say to the as to the opposite position. So I want you to think about this as you're reading this, and I want you to read Wilder's, and I want you to think about if we would respond, right, what would be an appropriate response to this? And I mean, this is someone who's calling for the mass expulsion of Muslims. Says that there are 50 million Muslims in Europe, and he says they're basically, they can remain Muslim, but they have to believe that the Quran is evil. That Quran is equal to Mian Kaf, right? So, but they have the freedom to be Muslim, but as long as they believe that, and we must ban the Quran as an evil text. So we're not very far away from book burnings, we're not very far away from the Inquisition, we're not very far away from the Holocaust, because the thing is, often people forget that the Holocaust, if he actually read Mian Kaf, which I'm sure idiots like him would not even bother reading it, Mian Kaf, it lives, the message of Mian Kaf is hate. It lives on alarmism. Oh, these people can never assimilate, but Mian Kaf is Jews, right? And they can never assimilate, and they're very different than Germans, and no matter what they do, no matter what the appearances are, Semites are Semites, and the superior race is a superior race, and they're seeping, and they're taking control, and they're moving by stealthily, and they're controlling everything. And then initially, Mian Kaf doesn't say the solution is kill them all. Mian Kaf says the solution is throw them out. But once you gather all these people and hold them, right, then people start getting bright ideas like, well, they're a financial burden. Well, because he says, vast internment. It says, oh, we'll give them a choice to either be interned or leave. And so you intern people, and then, of course, have no other country to go to. If you ask, the countries of origin to take them, they'll say, no, thank you, we have enough in our own. So, and so you end up holding them, and then you say, well, why don't we make them work? And then, oh, they're a financial burden, oh, they're not, so you start getting rid of them, and so on. And it's remarkable that it's not that long ago, people. I mean, it's the Holocaust and the Japanese internment camps are not that long ago, and yet we cycle back. And what I find totally remarkable is that if you take native cultures, I mean, even if you take Buddhist or Hindu or Muslim, you find that they enjoy far more historical stability than the conquering culture of Anglo-Saxonia, this culture of, and the Roman Catholic emperor, the culture of the Roman Catholic emperor, it's which has always been, one extreme move against another extreme move, and this which is, the colonials described as Oriental despotism. What they were talking about is that to them, Orientalism, the Orient basically, seemed comparatively sedated, serene, and it's really when do you find that the East starts engaging in these bizarre acts of the Hindus massacring Muslims and so on, it is in the shade of colonialism. You really find these remarkably egregious acts. But it is quite, and this is, by the way, this is not new. I mean, this is a lot of philosophers that already noticed that and wrote about it. But it is not genetic. It is culture. It is culture, and it is not theology, because this is. I don't think that there's, Christian theology of love can be used to produce great illuminations and ecstatic sights. From anywhere from Kierkegaard to C.S. Lewis, I find C.S. Lewis very, or Whitehead was his theology of beauty and so on. To, of course, the Inquisition and all the ugliness and in many ways, an idiot like this, he doesn't want to confront the extent to which we are just, it's just as we witness the same cycle over and over taking place in the European subcontinent, Western Europe in particular, and but who knows? I mean, it's there's definitely the history is quite taken to extremes. But it's that's quite you say this, of course, as you can I mean I'm sure that this would be returning the gaze, as one could say. We're used to the West looking at the other and looking at the history of the other and judging the history of the other, but for the other to return the gaze and to look at the history of the West and to say, I see patterns, is quite unprecedented and not acceptable as mainstream. I mean, it is the only gaze that Western historiography has recognized is the internal gaze, and even then, when Wilder, for instance, raves against socialism and socialists. And he's talking about socialism as if socialism is an Islamic invention, as if it was invented by Muslims, but in the same way that he in his in this rave against socialist ideas and so on, socialism often, or the socialist historian, has often been the critic from within the Western culture, and this connection to Western culture has always been, you could say, like the connections of the Mu'tazila in Islamic culture. Some people want to cut it off as not legitimate, as a heresy, as non-authentic, and some people say no, it's the best of what our culture produced. And of course, there's a huge difference between communism and socialism, as I'm sure you understand. There's a very huge difference between Marxism, communism, and socialism, and that doesn't imply that I am. I'm not making an argument for or against socialism. That's not my point. But it is the role of the critic, and whether Western historiography has recognized a critic other than the critic from within, and even then, rather quite contingently. Anyway, very interesting intellectual issues that. But imagine trying to in response say all of that to to Wilder and his party, it is like, you know, it's the American in American law you say you don't have a right to scream fire in a crowded theater, right? And it is as if someone comes and screams fire